Hi, this is Amy for Blitz, and we are joined here today at the White House by David Stratton. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Amy.
Thank you. And so we'll just get straight into it. David Stratton, A Cinematic Life, the new documentary, comes out on March 9th, and it sort of chronicles, you know, not only your life, but in conjunction, the life of Australian cinema. And so after 50 years working in the industry, did you think that a feature film would be made about you?
No, I never thought that. But now that it has, I found it a bit nerve-wracking to watch the first time. But I think the director, Sally Aitken's, done a fantastic job with it. And we've had several preview screenings around the country. And they've all been very, very well received, and you can tell that audiences are really enjoying this sort of combination of lots and lots and lots of clips from Australian films, some very famous, some not so famous, and aspects of my life. And somehow Sally has blended elements of the two so that one almost feeds off the other, and she's done it really brilliantly, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And how was it being able to talk to all these directors and actors and writers and producers in the Australian industry?
Well, most of them I've known for a very long time, so it was like spending time with old friends, really. But this time it was slightly different because we weren't talking so much about their films as about other aspects of the Australian film industry. I mean, again, I'd never seen a film before where one filmmaker would be talking about another filmmakers' work and how much it influenced them. So when Gillian Armstrong, for example, talks about Picnic and Hanging Rock and how it influenced her, I found that really interesting. And then Jocelyn Moorhouse talks about how my brilliant career influenced her, and you can see how the influences go on and on.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see, and there's along with your sort of journey into the Australian industry, there's the journey of Australian film and all these influences and everything. And it's sort of interesting, to look at the progression. And where do you see that progression leading in terms of the future of Australian film?
I think Australian cinema always faces challenges. On one level, it's easier to make films these days than ever before because you can make them on an iPhone if you want to. The problem is to get them seen. And that's always been the problem for Australian films. Unless you've got a distributor that is really going to put some money into promoting and marketing, then you've got no hope of finding an audience because you'll be overcome by the Hollywood juggernaut. And you'd be surprised how many times in the past I've mentioned a Australian film which I think was quite significant that opened recently, and people would say, "Oh, never even heard of it."
Yes.
You know, I mean, so that's the biggest drawback, I think. I mean, I think we've got the talent here. We've got great storytellers. We've got great filmmakers. We've got wonderful actors, cinematographers, editors, composers, all of that. The biggest problem is to find how to get audiences to see them. And something else, Amy, that I would address particularly to your audience. Why don't young people support Australian films more? For example, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a wonderful film called The Babadook. Which was a thriller, horror film, if you like. Now, young people tend to go for Hollywood horror films, and The Babadook did pretty well overseas, but here in Australia, it opened, I think, the same week as a very inferior Hollywood horror film. And guess which one everybody went to see?
The Hollywood one, of course.
Yeah, of course. And I can't understand why young people don't support this kind of Australian film, because they're so much better in many cases than the Hollywood product. Well,
do you think at all sort of streaming platforms are going to change that at all?
Well, they might, and I mean, that would be great if they did, although it's so good to be able to see it, especially that kind of film, in the cinema, you know, with a big crowd, and so that you jump when things happen.
Yes, definitely. And, just on to extending on sort of the internet and streaming platforms and things like that. So you and Margaret Pomeranz were on our screens for about 30 years. And for many people, you were sort of the main voice of opinion for cinema. But nowadays, there's so many blogs and YouTube channels and things like that give an opinion on cinema. How would you suggest people find a voice that they trust?
Well, I think they can only experiment, try various voices, as you say, until they find one they agree with.
Right.
I mean, when I was young, the only source of film reviews were in newspapers and magazines. Every newspaper and every magazine had its own film critic.
Yeah.
And from quite an early age, I tried to, when I was at school, they had a variety of all the daily newspapers and magazines. And I'd go through them every week, because reviews mostly came out on a Friday, I think. And read the reviews, and then after I'd seen the film, decide which reviewer was closest to my own taste. And then I knew, okay, this guy I can rely on. And it's the same thing today. I think you've got to just experiment, look around until you find a voice you agree with.
Yeah,
or maybe you should be that voice.
I can try. For something a bit relevant, what was your take on the Oscars? They were just on Monday here.
Well, unfortunately, I was flying from Perth to Brisbane while the Oscars were on. It's the first time in my memory that I missed them, and it was obviously quite a formidable night.
Yes.
I must say, and I don't want to boast about this because it's the most peculiar for me. There was a piece in the Australian where I was predicting what might win, and I actually got all the main categories correct. So I was quite surprised about that. It was a very strong year, actually.
Yeah, especially for Australian films. We had an Australian take home an Oscar for sound mixing, I believe, for Hacksaw Ridge, and we had 2 films nominated in a number of categories, which is fantastic to see.
That was very good for Australia. I mean, Australia punches above its weight, and when you think of all those Australian actors and technicians who are working internationally, I mean, it's we do incredibly well.
And what advice, just extending on what you were talking about before, is there particular advice that you would give to young Australians who are passionate about film?
Well, maintain that passion as long as you can. I would say, and this maybe doesn't go for everybody, but my feeling is that the more you inform yourself about film history as well as contemporary cinema, the better you will be in assessing the qualities of contemporary films. So I would see as many films as you can from the past as well as the present. And every time you see a film, I would suggest you write or record a review, whether it's going to be used or not doesn't matter. It's just the exercise of doing it, and just keep inquiring and keep exploring. And there might be areas of film that you haven't even begun to think about, which will be incredibly rewarding when you find them.
Yeah. And in the film, there's a sort of section about you having changed your mind on films, and the main focus on that in the film is the castle. Are there any other films that you found over time your opinion has changed?
Not really, no. I mean, The Castle is certainly the main example, because, as you know, The Castle is a comedy, and comedy is very difficult, I think, to translate sometimes. And growing up as I did in England, I guess I still have basically a very English sense of humour. The Castle is an absolutely quintessential Australian comedy.
Yes.
And the first time I saw it, I found it a bit caricatured.
It's very laconic.
Yeah, sure. But, I mean, I just found the caricatures grated on me a bit.
Right.
And also, although I didn't probably express this very well, it was a very basic film. There was nothing very cinematic about it, if you see what I mean. So there was the combination of those two things made me rate it fairly low on the scale. But then people started saying to me, "Oh, you're wrong about the castle. You're wrong about the castle." So I watched it again, and I thought, "Oh, maybe." And then I watched it again, and after about the fifth time, I began to fall in love with these characters, and now I have changed my mind about that film, and I think it is. I don't think it's a great film, but I think it's a great portrait of an Australian family, and a very loving and affectionate one.
Yeah, so it's more the characters and the story rather than the actual sort of cinematic storytelling that you've warmed to.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so is there any film that sticks out to you as a particularly important or iconic Australian film?
Well, for me, the one that first comes to mind is Newsfront, which was made by Phil Noyce in 1978. It was his first feature. It was written by Bob Ellis, who's a great screenwriter, and had a wonderful cast: Chris Hayward, Bill Hunter, Wendy Hughes, Brian Brown, so many great actors. And it's set during a 10-year period from 1946 to 1956. And it looks at what was happening in Australia during that period, but through the eyes of newsreel cameramen and their lives and their families and so on and so on. And it combines comedy, drama, high emotion, and an insight into the politics of the time, which and the combination of all of that is very skillful, I think, an original combination. And since it was made relatively early in the revival of Australian cinema, I think it's an absolute standout.
Yeah, great. And there was a subject that I was able to study here about Australian cinema. Do you think that if people are studying film here, that is something that they should have to look at? Because I wondered myself, after doing the subject, whether it should be, I guess, mandatory for people to do.
To look at what?
Australian cinema, yeah.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think, for me, it was just having the opportunity to see all these different films that I suppose, especially something like Wake and Fright, which ended up being sort of the favourite of the semester. Yeah. And for years and years, it was something that was really hard to find, I think, to watch.
It was within a week of being lost altogether.
Yeah.
When they managed to locate the negative. And I mean, it is amazing. I mean, you don't think that films made relatively recently, 45 years ago or whatever it was, are still so vulnerable to be completely lost. But that is more likely to happen with Australian films because each film practically is made by a different production company. Yeah. There's no continuity like there is in Hollywood or other places. So thank goodness Wake and Fright was assembled again and put together and restored and can be now seen again for the great Australian film that it is.
Yes. Yeah. And lastly, do you think that there is a way, as we touched upon before, there is a bit of a trouble in the audience culture in Australia. Yeah. Do you think that there is a way to change it, or is it just up to the individual?
Well, I think it's up to a lot of things. I think the educational system should perhaps spend a bit more time encouraging students to look at the best Australian films. But in the end, of course, it is up to the individual to want to seek out these films. And there are lots and lots of good ones, past, present, and future. So there's a wealth to discover if you haven't discovered it.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, David.
Thank you, Amy.
An absolute pleasure to talk to you.
It's been very nice to talk to you too. Thanks.
And good luck with the rest of the press tour, and I hope everyone goes and sees the movie when it comes out next week.
Thank you.